This old hag only adds tension to every room she walks into, Ashley said lightly, lifting her wine glass as if she had just made a harmless joke. And for a moment the clinking of silverware against porcelain was the only sound in the Whitmore dining room. The Sunday dinner had started like so many others in Margaret Whitmore's colonial home in Fairfield County, Connecticut, the long oak table polished to a soft glow, the roast chicken resting at the center beside bowls of mashed potatoes and green beans seasoned the way her late husband had always liked, the linen napkins folded with careful precision. The grandchildren seated halfway down the table whispering to each other about school projects and soccer practice. Margaret, 68 years old and widowed for just over 2 years, had spent the afternoon moving steadily through her kitchen, measuring ingredients with the same glass measuring cup she had owned for 3 decades, setting the thermostat to a comfortable 72 degrees, making sure the porch light was on before dusk settled over the quiet street. She had believed, perhaps stubbornly, that family dinners still meant something, that tradition could hold people together even when affection thinned. When Ashley's words floated across the table, delivered in that airy, almost playful tone, Margaret did not flinch. She did not raise her voice. She simply placed her fork down beside her plate and folded her napkin once, twice, aligning its edges as though precision alone could steady the air. Daniel, seated to Ashley's right, gave a quick, embarrassed chuckle, the kind meant to smooth over discomfort, and reached for his water glass without meeting his mother's eyes. The grandchildren stared at their plates. No one said, "That's enough." No one said, "Mom deserves better." The chandelier above cast a warm, golden light that made everything appear softer than it felt. Margaret's face remained composed, her silver hair pinned neatly at the nape of her neck, her pearl earrings catching the light each time she turned her head slightly. If anyone had looked closely, they might have noticed the way her knuckles whitened for a brief second around the stem of her own glass before she loosened her grip. She had hosted Thanksgiving here, Christmas here, birthdays measured in candles and photographs, each memory layered into the walls like quiet wallpaper. And yet, as Ashley reached for the gravy boat and continued chatting about a recent home renovation, it was as if Margaret had become an extra in a house she had paid off 20 years earlier, after writing the final mortgage check in careful blue ink. She lifted her fork again and took another bite, chewing slowly, deliberately, as though the rhythm of the meal could not be broken by a single sentence. The clock above the pantry door ticked steadily. Outside, a car passed, headlights sweeping briefly across the front window. Inside, the family resumed its low hum of conversation, but something had shifted, something small and sharp lodged between them. Margaret did not argue. She did not defend herself. She simply listened, her gaze calm and unreadable, as if she were already measuring something far more important than words. The rest of the evening unfolded with the same polite rhythm that Margaret had perfected over decades, plates passed from hand to hand, the grandchildren eventually asking for seconds, Ashley describing paint samples and kitchen hardware as though she were narrating a home improvement show, and Daniel nodding along in quiet agreement. But beneath the surface Margaret felt a subtle rearranging of something she had once considered solid. After dessert, she carried the empty pie dish to the sink and turned on the warm water, watching steam rise as it clouded the small window above the counter, her reflection blurred and indistinct for a moment before the glass cleared again. She moved carefully, methodically, rinsing each plate before placing it into the dishwasher, aligning them with the same measured precision she had used when balancing the family budget years earlier, when every dollar had mattered and every receipt had been folded and saved inside a shoebox in the hall closet. In the dining room, she could hear Ashley laughing softly about an upcoming vacation, something about a beach house rental that cost more per week than Margaret had once earned in a month when she was working part-time while raising Daniel. The house, built 28 years ago on a half-acre lot with a white picket fence and a maple tree that now stretched taller than the roofline, had always been her anchor, her proof that patience and discipline could build something lasting. Yet tonight it felt as though the rooms had shifted, as if the walls were quietly measuring her usefulness. When Daniel stepped into the kitchen and leaned against the counter, he cleared his throat and said that Ashley had not meant anything by her comment, that she had a sharp sense of humor, and that everyone knew she was only teasing. Margaret dried her hands on a dish towel, and looked at her son with a steady gaze that did not accuse and did not forgive. She simply nodded once, as if accepting a weather report. She remembered another dinner 2 months earlier when Ashley had suggested that perhaps the house was too large for one person and that a senior community with amenities might be more convenient. The word convenient hanging in the air like a polite eviction notice. She remembered the way Daniel had changed the subject then, the way he did now, unwilling to step fully into discomfort. When the family finally gathered their coats and stepped onto the front porch, the night air carried a cool breeze that rustled the maple leaves, and Margaret stood at the doorway, watching the red glow of their tail lights disappear down the quiet suburban street. She locked the door, checked the thermostat, and walked slowly through the living room, pausing in front of the framed photograph of her late husband smiling beside that same dining table. The house was silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant ticking of the hallway clock. Margaret sat in her armchair, folded her hands in her lap, and replayed the evening not as a wound but as information, each word, each silence, fitting together like pieces of a puzzle she had not known she was assembling until now. The following morning arrived with a pale winter light stretching across the hardwood floors, and Margaret rose at 6:30 as she always did, her routine unchanged even if something inside her had shifted slightly out of place. She brewed her coffee in the same ceramic drip pot she had used for years, measuring 2 level tablespoons for every 6 ounces of water, and carried her mug to the small breakfast nook that overlooked the backyard, where frost clung to the grass in a thin, silver layer. The house felt steady again in the quiet, as though it belonged fully to her when no one else was inside it. She opened the drawer beneath the sideboard and took out a slim folder where she kept property, tax statements, insurance papers, and the deed to the house, each document protected in clear plastic sleeves. She did not rush. She simply reviewed dates and signatures, tracing her name written in careful script, remembering the day she and her husband had signed the final mortgage payment at the bank, how they had celebrated with takeout Chinese food and paper plates because the kitchen had still been under renovation. Later that week, Daniel stopped by alone, claiming he had been in the neighborhood after a meeting in Stamford, and he stood in the living room glancing around as if measuring the square footage with his eyes. He mentioned rising property values, how similar homes on half-acre lots were selling quickly, how it might be wise to think ahead before maintenance became overwhelming. Margaret listened from her armchair, hands folded loosely, noticing how he avoided sitting fully, how he remained near the doorway as though already halfway out. She recalled another moment from the previous spring when Ashley had rearranged the dining room seating chart for Easter brunch, placing Margaret at the far end of the table while taking the seat at the head, explaining that it was simply more practical for serving dishes. Practical had become a word that disguised displacement. Margaret did not confront Daniel now. She asked him whether he would like coffee, and when he declined, she watched him study the framed photographs along the mantel, pictures of him in a Little League uniform, high school graduation, wedding day. He commented that large houses could feel lonely, that perhaps it would be comforting to live closer to them, maybe even combine households in a more modern arrangement. Margaret nodded thoughtfully, as though considering a magazine suggestion rather than a rearrangement of her entire life. After he left, she stood by the front window and observed the empty driveway, the silence returning like a familiar companion. She understood then that the remark at dinner had not been spontaneous. It had been a signal, a small crack in a larger design. Instead of feeling wounded, she felt clarity forming, a slow alignment of details that had been scattered over months. She walked back to the kitchen, opened her planner, and wrote down 2 names she had not contacted in years, an estate attorney in town and a financial advisor her husband had trusted. The handwriting was steady. Whatever conversation had begun at that dining table, she intended to finish it on her own terms. 2 days later, Margaret sat in a modest brick office building on Main Street, the kind with a narrow hallway and framed diplomas arranged in symmetrical rows, her coat folded neatly across her lap as she waited for Harold Benson, the estate attorney who had once helped her and her husband draft their first will nearly 20 years earlier. The waiting room smelled faintly of coffee and paper, and outside the front window traffic moved steadily past the storefronts that had been part of the town long before new condominiums began rising near the train station. When Mr. Benson stepped out to greet her, his hair now more silver than brown. He smiled with polite familiarity and guided her into his office where a large wooden desk faced two upholstered chairs. Margaret sat upright, hands resting calmly on her purse, and explained that she wished to review her current estate plan, not because of any emergency, but because she believed clarity was overdue. She described her assets in measured detail: the fully paid-off house on half an acre, her retirement savings, a modest investment account, and a college fund she had quietly started for each grandchild years earlier. Mr. Benson listened carefully and asked whether anything specific had prompted the review. Margaret paused only briefly before saying that circumstances change and that she preferred to anticipate rather than react. She did not repeat the remark from dinner. She did not describe Ashley's tone. She simply said that she wanted her wishes to be honored without interpretation or influence. Mr. Benson nodded and explained options, including establishing a trust that would distribute funds directly for the grandchildren's education and housing expenses, shielding those assets from outside control. He also mentioned adding clear language about property rights to ensure that her home could not be transferred without her explicit consent. Margaret felt no surge of anger as she listened, only a growing steadiness, as though she were aligning pieces of furniture in a room that had slowly drifted out of place. After signing preliminary paperwork and scheduling a follow-up appointment, she stepped back onto the sidewalk where the air carried a crisp edge of late autumn. She walked 2 blocks to a small financial planning office and arranged a consultation for the following week, requesting a comprehensive review of her accounts and beneficiary designations. That evening, back in her quiet living room, she placed the folder of updated documents on the coffee table and sat for a long moment beneath the soft glow of the floor lamp. The house did not feel threatened. It felt fortified. She understood now that words spoken lightly could signal intentions spoken seriously elsewhere. Instead of waiting for another suggestion about convenience or practicality, she was building her own structure of protection, layer by layer, with the same patience she had once used to build this home. The next family dinner was already on the calendar, and Margaret intended to attend it exactly as before, calm and composed, knowing that the foundation beneath her feet was no longer open for negotiation. By the end of the week, Margaret had completed the second appointment with her financial advisor, a careful man in his early 60s who reviewed her statements line by line beneath the bright lights of a conference room that overlooked the commuter rail tracks. She listened as he explained beneficiary structures and account access levels, her expression steady, asking precise questions about distribution timing and legal protections rather than emotional hypotheticals. She instructed him to reroute the existing college funds into a structured trust that would release tuition payments directly to accredited institutions, ensuring that neither Daniel nor Ashley would manage those accounts. She also transferred a significant portion of her liquid savings into a conservative portfolio that required dual authentication and in-person verification for any major withdrawal. None of these decisions felt dramatic. They felt organized. When she returned home that afternoon, she walked through each room slowly, noticing details she had once overlooked: the faint scratch on the hallway baseboard from when Daniel had ridden his toy truck too close to the wall at age 5, the faint discoloration on the kitchen ceiling from a leak repaired 10 years earlier, the maple tree outside, now shedding its last leaves into the yard she still mowed herself every other Saturday during warmer months. The following Sunday, another family dinner approached, this time hosted at Daniel and Ashley's newer house 20 minutes away, a larger property with an open-concept floor plan and a kitchen island wide enough to seat 4. Margaret arrived precisely at 5 o'clock, carrying a homemade apple pie in a glass dish, her coat neatly folded over her arm. Ashley greeted her with a bright smile that did not reach her eyes and commented on how good it was that Margaret had been keeping busy lately. During dinner, conversation drifted toward real estate again, with Ashley mentioning a new senior living development that featured landscaped walking paths, a fitness center, and a clubhouse with weekly social events. She described it as vibrant and supportive, emphasizing how convenient it would be to have maintenance handled by professionals. Margaret listened without interrupting, cutting her chicken into small, even pieces, her posture relaxed. When Daniel added that managing a large property alone could become exhausting, she looked at him thoughtfully and asked whether he believed she seemed overwhelmed. He hesitated, then replied that he was only thinking ahead. Margaret nodded once and said that thinking ahead was wise. Her tone carried no irritation, only clarity. Later that evening, as she drove home under the steady glow of streetlights, she felt a quiet certainty settle inside her. They believed they were guiding the conversation toward inevitability. They believed subtle repetition would wear her down. Instead, each suggestion confirmed that her preparations had been necessary. She parked in her driveway, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment in the stillness, understanding that patience was not weakness. It was timing. On Wednesday afternoon, Margaret received a call from Harold Benson confirming that the revised trust documents were ready for final signatures, and she scheduled the appointment without mentioning it to anyone in her family. She drove downtown under a clear sky, parking in the same metered space she had used the week before, carrying a leather folder that now felt less like paperwork and more like structure. Inside the attorney's office, she reviewed every page carefully, her reading glasses resting low on her nose as she examined the clauses that directed the majority of her estate into an educational trust for her grandchildren, funds that would cover tuition, housing, and essential expenses only when billed directly by recognized institutions. Another section specified that the house on Maple Ridge Drive would remain solely under her ownership for the duration of her lifetime and could not be transferred, refinanced, or listed for sale without her written authorization witnessed by counsel. There was also a charitable provision in her late husband's name, allocating a meaningful percentage of her investment portfolio to a local community scholarship foundation after her passing, a quiet gesture that reflected the values they had shared. Margaret signed her name slowly and deliberately, the ink dark and steady across the signature line. When the documents were notarized and placed into a sealed envelope, she felt neither triumph nor bitterness. She felt alignment. That evening Daniel called unexpectedly, his tone cautious, asking whether she had given any more thought to simplifying her living situation before winter arrived. Margaret stood by the kitchen counter, the cordless phone resting lightly against her ear, and replied that she had indeed been thinking ahead. She explained that she had finalized important financial arrangements to ensure long-term stability for the family, particularly for the children's education. Daniel paused, then asked what she meant by arrangements. She answered calmly that she had established formal protections so that resources would be distributed directly and responsibly, without confusion or pressure. There was a silence on the line that stretched longer than usual. Daniel cleared his throat and said he hoped she did not think anyone was pressuring her. Margaret responded that she preferred clarity over assumption. She wished him a good evening and ended the call without raising her voice. Later she placed the sealed envelope into a fireproof lockbox inside her bedroom closet, alongside the original deed and insurance policies. The act was simple, almost ordinary, yet it marked a quiet boundary that had not existed before. Outside, the temperature dropped into the low 40s, and a thin wind moved through the branches of the maple tree in her yard. Margaret prepared herself a cup of chamomile tea and sat in her armchair, listening to the steady hum of the furnace turning on for the first time that season. She understood that the next family gathering would not be about food or casual conversation. It would be about expectations. And this time, she would not be the only one who had prepared. The next Sunday, Margaret returned to her own dining room with a sense of composure that felt almost ceremonial, as though she were stepping onto a familiar stage with a script only she had fully read. She had invited Daniel, Ashley, and the children for dinner again, preparing pot roast with carrots and red potatoes slow-cooked for 4 hours, the aroma filling the house long before the doorbell rang at 5 o'clock sharp. She wore a navy blue sweater and a thin gold bracelet that had belonged to her mother, her posture straight, her movements unhurried as she welcomed them inside. Ashley complimented the scent of the food and placed a store-bought salad on the counter, mentioning how busy their week had been with work meetings and school events. Daniel glanced around the living room, his eyes briefly pausing on the maple tree visible through the front window, now nearly bare as winter approached. The children settled at the table, their laughter lighter than the undercurrent running between the adults. Dinner began pleasantly enough, conversation drifting from school projects to holiday plans, but Margaret sensed a certain anticipation in Ashley's tone, as if she expected another opening to revisit the subject of convenience and future arrangements. Instead, Midway through the meal, Margaret set her fork down gently and folded her napkin with deliberate care. She looked first at her grandchildren and asked about their classes, listening closely as they described math assignments and history presentations. Then she turned her attention to Daniel and Ashley, her voice even and clear. She said that she had recently finalized her estate planning and financial protections, explaining that she believed responsible planning prevented misunderstandings later. Ashley's smile tightened slightly, and Daniel shifted in his seat. Margaret continued without raising her voice, stating that the house would remain under her sole ownership for the duration of her life, and that her financial resources had been structured to benefit the children directly through protected educational trusts. She added that she had also created a charitable scholarship in her late husband's name, something she felt honored to establish. The room grew quieter, not with hostility, but with recalculation. Daniel asked whether she felt pressured into making changes. Margaret met his gaze steadily and replied that she felt prepared. She explained that thinking ahead was wise, and she had taken that advice seriously. Ashley attempted a light laugh, suggesting that they had only been concerned for her comfort. Margaret nodded once and said that comfort comes from clarity, not relocation. There was no anger in her tone, only certainty. Outside, the wind moved softly through the branches, and inside the chandelier cast the same warm light as always, yet the balance at the table had shifted. Margaret resumed her meal, calm and composed, knowing that the conversation they had expected to guide had quietly been redirected, and that for the first time in months, the foundation beneath her felt entirely her own. After dinner that evening, the children were the first to leave the table, carrying their plates carefully toward the kitchen as they had been taught, their voices returning to a softer, more natural tone now that the tension between the adults had settled into something less visible but far more solid. Ashley followed with a practiced smile, insisting she would help with the dishes, yet her movements were tighter than usual, the clink of porcelain against the sink just slightly sharper. Daniel remained seated for a moment longer, elbows resting on the table, staring at the polished wood surface as though searching for a version of the conversation that had gone differently. Margaret rose calmly and began clearing the remaining plates, thanking Ashley for the salad and complimenting the children on their manners, her voice steady and warm without yielding an inch of authority. In the kitchen, as warm water ran over the plates, Ashley spoke in a lower tone, saying that she hoped Margaret understood they had only been trying to support her future. Margaret dried a dish with deliberate care and replied that support does not require assumption, and that independence is not the same as isolation. She did not accuse. She did not defend. She simply stated a boundary as plainly as one might state the day of the week. Daniel stepped into the doorway and mentioned that financial structures could become complicated, that perhaps they should all sit down together with a professional to review the details. Margaret looked at him evenly and said that everything had already been reviewed thoroughly and legally, and that there was no confusion to clarify. The statement hung in the air with quiet finality. When coats were gathered and goodbyes exchanged, Ashley's hug was brief and cool, Daniel's handshake lingering a second too long, as if searching for reassurance that was no longer available. After the front door closed and the sound of their car faded down the street, Margaret walked back into the dining room, where the chandelier still cast its soft glow over the now empty chairs. She adjusted one slightly, aligning it with the table, then moved to the window and looked out at the dark silhouette of the maple tree. Against the night sky, the house felt different again, not heavier but clearer, as though an invisible draft had finally been sealed. She understood that the balance of expectation had shifted permanently. There would likely be more conversations, perhaps softer in tone yet sharper in intention, but the uncertainty that once lingered around her future had been replaced with structure. Margaret turned off the dining room light, leaving only the lamp in the living room casting a warm circle across the floor, and sat down with a sense of composure that did not require validation. Whatever assumptions had once surrounded her were now facing something steady and immovable, and in that quiet, she realized that the greatest change had not occurred at the table. It had occurred within her. In the weeks that followed, the conversations shifted in tone, softer on the surface, yet edged with a new caution that had not existed before, and Margaret observed it all with the same quiet awareness she once used to track household expenses down to the last dollar. Daniel began calling more frequently, asking about minor repairs around the house, offering to arrange contractors, suggesting small upgrades that might increase resale value someday. Ashley sent articles about community events and active adult neighborhoods, each message framed as thoughtful consideration. Margaret responded politely, thanking them for their concern while making no commitments and offering no openings. One afternoon, she invited her grandchildren over to bake cookies, measuring flour and sugar carefully while explaining the importance of reading instructions fully before beginning any project. The children listened as she described how planning ahead makes everything steadier, how choices made calmly often shape the future more than words spoken in haste. She did not mention trusts or legal documents. She simply spoke about responsibility, about building something that lasts. Later that evening, Daniel stopped by unannounced, his expression less confident than usual. He admitted that he and Ashley had assumed the house would eventually become part of their long-term plans, that they had imagined expanding it or selling it to fund other investments. Margaret listened without interruption, then told him gently that assumptions can feel comfortable until they meet reality. She explained that her decisions were not punishments but protections, designed to ensure fairness and stability for the next generation. Daniel asked whether there was room for discussion. Margaret replied that there is always room for respect, but not for entitlement. The statement was delivered without sharpness, yet it settled firmly between them. As winter deepened and the first light snow covered the yard in a thin white layer, Margaret stood by the window watching the maple tree branches hold their quiet outline against the gray sky. The house felt steady, not because it was large or valuable, but because it was hers, earned through decades of patience and discipline. She understood now that dignity does not arrive in loud declarations. It arrives in boundaries drawn calmly and maintained consistently. The next family gathering would come, as they always do, but the dynamic had already changed. Margaret had not raised her voice. She had not argued across the dinner table. She had simply chosen clarity over fear. And in doing so, she transformed a moment of public dismissal into a private reclamation of authority, proving that the strongest response is not reaction, but preparation.